Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. In this video, I want to quickly go over some of the main ideas and topics of Period 3, which lasted between 1741 and 1800. It makes up 12% of the APUSH test in May. The beginning of Period 3 was the start of the French and Indian War. So here are some things that you should know. Why and how the French and Indian War became a major turning point between England and the colonies. So remember, the end result of the French and Indian War was that France was basically out of North America and Britain had control of North America, Canada, and to the Mississippi River. So what were some of the results of the French and Indian War for the colonists? It was the end of salutary neglect. So now Britain would be enforcing a lot of their policies that they were not enforcing before. The British needed the tax money to pay for the expense of the troops in the French and Indian War. It was a very costly war. So a big takeaway was now that Britain was tightening its control on the colonists. Now, at this time, you also had a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, which were being read and appreciated much in the colonies. Great example of this would be John Locke. Later on, you would have the writing of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, who said it did not make sense for a small island to rule over a continent thousands of miles away across the ocean. So also remember that early on, there were not large calls of independence in the colonies. They still wanted to be part of Britain. They just wanted it to be treated better and not taxed as much. The factors that contributed to the American Revolutionary War and why the colonies eventually were victorious. So remember, there was a series of laws like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts. The colonists wanted representation in Parliament if they were going to be taxed. The response of the king and Parliament was that you are virtually represented, so virtual representation, simply because you are British subjects. So there were also a bunch of protests. You have the Sons of Liberty, you have the Boston Massacre, you have the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress met, which eventually would lead to the American Revolutionary War. And the reason the Americans were victorious was due to no small part the French alliance. So the colonists were able to be victorious and became the United States. During the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence was written. Also during the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation, the first national government, was established. Now, there were a lot of weaknesses to the Articles of Confederation, but the Revolutionary War was won under the Articles of Confederation. And then you had the Constitution, written at the Constitutional Convention, which called for a more powerful central government. Some things to keep in mind from the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. The Northwest Ordinance was passed under the Articles of Confederation. Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion which underscored the lack of power that the national government had under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, the states were behaving pretty much like independent nations under the Articles of Confederation. The Whiskey Rebellion, which happened after the Constitution, underscored how the federal government can put down an uprising, unlike under the Articles of Confederation and Shays' Rebellion. There were a bunch of compromises at the Constitutional Convention. The Great Compromise called for a bicameral legislature. You had the Three-Fifths Compromise, federalism, the form of government where there is a national government or a central government, which is supreme, and then state governments, separation of power, and then checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So under Washington as the first president, political parties were formed. This is the first party system. So this was the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans were the two first political parties. You had Hamilton's economic plan, the French Revolution, and Washington's farewell address. So remember, a big takeaway from Washington and John Adams' administration was that they were trying to stay out of the French and British conflict. Hamilton's economic plan, which called for a national bank and high protective tariffs, quickly turned into a conflict between Hamilton's followers and Jefferson's followers. Remember, Jefferson feared a strong central government, thought most of the power should be with the states, and had an agrarian view of what American society should look like. Washington's farewell address, he warned against sectionalism, getting involved in foreign entanglements, and political parties. During Period 3, there were many treaties. There was the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the French and Indian War and again basically took France out of North America. You have the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War, and Britain had to accept the United States as an independent country. And the United States boundary went from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, but Britain still kept British Canada. You also had Jay's Treaty, which was controversial. It was with Britain, and a lot of people did not like it because they thought it still allowed Britain to bully the United States. You also had the Pinckney Treaty, which gave the United States access to New Orleans as a duty free port and control of the Mississippi River. This was a very popular treaty. It also allowed for Western expansion towards the Mississippi River without fear of conflict with Spain. You also had the Treaty of Greenville, which was with the Western Confederacy in the Ohio River Valley, which basically eliminated Native American claims to the land and opened it to white settlers. Period 3 ends with the election of Jefferson and is often called the Revolution of 1800. It was the first peaceful transition of power to a new political party. So the Federalists had dominated for the end of Period 3, and then the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans would dominate for the earlier part of Period 4. I hope this information helps. Again, this is just an overview of some of the main ideas and topics of Period 3.